I hadn't set foot on my property in a full year. 12 months of city life, work, and endless obligations had pulled me away, and I'd missed every single sunrise over the lake, every quiet morning breeze through the trees. I imagined coming back to my little slice of heaven, expecting the familiar smell of pine and damp earth, the gentle sound of the water lapping at the shore, maybe even a deer or two peeking out from the brush. What I didn't expect was this. I drove up the long, winding driveway, my tires crunching over gravel, and froze mid-step. My jaw literally ached from clenching it so hard. Houses everywhere, bright cookie-cutter homes with white fences and manicured lawns sprawled across my property like some bad dream come to life. The sound of hammers, saws, and engines filled the air, competing with the chirping of birds that were clearly confused by all this sudden human chaos. At first, I thought I'd misremembered the boundaries of my land. Maybe the HOA had expanded while I was gone. No, I'd checked the papers before I left. My land, all mine. Yet here were strangers sipping coffee on my porch, chatting like they'd lived there for decades, or this was the real kicker. They had HOA signs planted like tiny flags announcing dominion over my own backyard. I parked the truck and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots louder than I intended. One of the new neighbors, a man in a polo shirt and sunglasses that screamed, "I have no idea whose land this is, and I'm proud of it," waved casually at me. "Morning," he called out, "you must be new." My mouth went dry. "New? I've lived here for 10 years, I said, though my voice sounded small against the cacophony of construction. He frowned. Well, the HOA took care of things while you were gone. It's more organized now." Organized? My eyes swept across the land I had left untouched. My garden gone. My old fishing dock replaced with some absurdly fancy deck. And those houses were literally on top of the spots where I had staked my vegetable garden last year. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Deep breaths. I knew I needed to process this logically. After all, I'm not the type to lose my cool, but even as I walked forward, the absurdity kept piling up. A mailbox that wasn't mine, a miniature fountain where I used to grow tomatoes, and worst of all, a tiny HOA clubhouse with a sign that read, "Welcome to Harmony Hills, rules make us happy." I laughed nervously. "No, scratch that," I snorted out loud, and then I muttered, "They didn't just cross the line, they bulldozed it." I moved closer to inspect the houses. Every detail screamed planned community, identical paint, matching shutters, and wait a minute, some of them were built literally along the ridge of my lake. I leaned down and touched the dirt. It was still warm from the morning sun, freshly disturbed. Someone had poured their foundations in my absence. And that's when it hit me. The HOA didn't just expand. They had taken my land, turned it into mini homes, and oh no, I didn't even want to think it. They were probably planning to charge me fees, fines, or some ridiculous community contribution for daring to own land under their newly minted empire. I stepped back and looked over the horizon, letting the wind brush against my face. I could hear the faint chatter of the workers and the rhythmic pounding of hammers, like a soundtrack to a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My first instinct was anger, sharp and consuming. My second instinct, always the cooler one, was plotting. Yes, plotting. I had spent a year away, but I hadn't forgotten the basics. My property, my rules. And now this little HOA utopia thought they could waltz in and claim it as their own. Oh, they were going to find out. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I took a deep breath, letting the anger simmer just enough to taste. My land had been silent and peaceful for a year. And now it was a war zone disguised as a suburban dream. And I wasn't about to let it stand. I wandered further into my own land, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. The path I used to walk every morning, the one lined with wildflowers and the occasional rabbit burrow, was now a neat gravel walkway leading to houses that looked like they had been plucked straight from a magazine. My lake was partially hidden behind a new fence, and I caught a glimpse of someone sunbathing on what used to be my dock. My dock. I approached cautiously, unsure if I should introduce myself or just scream at the top of my lungs. That might have been the healthier choice, honestly. But before I could decide, a woman stepped out from one of the houses, clipboard in hand, hair perfectly styled as if no wind or weather had ever touched it. She looked at me like I'd just emerged from a time machine, half amused, half condescending. "You must be the property owner," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am," I said firmly. "This is my land." Her eyes twitched slightly. "Well, technically, it's part of the Harmony Hills community now." I blinked. "A community?" "Yes," she continued, brushing imaginary dust off her clipboard. "We've made some improvements while you were away. The HOA ensures everything is harmonious and follows proper zoning. You understand, right?" I stared at her. I wanted to laugh, but instead I just let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You mean you built houses across my land without telling me? That improvement?" She tilted her head. Perspective, I suppose. Anyway, it's all legal. Legal? She said it like it was a flavor of ice cream. I felt my blood pressure spike. My brain was simultaneously screaming and laughing at the absurdity. The HOA had the audacity to treat my land like a municipal playground. I took a slow breath. Okay, show me the paperwork. She handed over a folder, thick and pristine. I flipped through the pages, expecting legal jargon. What I got instead was a mix of HOA bylaws, property agreements, and signatures from people who had clearly never stepped foot on my property before. And there it was, a section about community easement rights, which in their eyes apparently gave them free reign over my land. I laughed, actually laughed, loudly enough to make a couple of construction workers glance up in confusion. You're kidding me? This is your idea of legal? You think this makes sense? She smiled, all teeth. It's enforceable. You could pay a fine or rent the houses back from us. That's the HOA standard procedure. Rent from me is my own land. I felt like I had been dropped into an alternate universe where logic and common sense had gone on permanent vacation. I wanted to pace, scream, throw things, maybe even run in circles until it all disappeared. But I knew better. Losing my temper wouldn't help. I needed a plan. I spent the next hour walking the property, trying to absorb the scale of what had been done. They had built at least 5 houses across areas I had staked years ago. Gardens, barns, even a small shed where I kept my tools. It was all gone, replaced with neatly painted houses and no trespassing signs. I counted the mailboxes, making a mental note of each one. Every so often, a neighbor waved or smiled like everything was normal. I waved back with what I hoped was a polite grin, though inside I was simmering. Humor was my defense mechanism, and right now I needed all of it. The absurdity was almost cinematic, me standing on my own land, being treated like a trespasser in a world that had moved on without me. I returned to the front of the property, feeling the weight of the situation settle in. My land, my sanctuary, my memories, all hijacked by a group of people who believed rules were more important than reality. And the HOA leader, somewhere inside that little office, probably sipping coffee, probably smug, probably thinking they'd won without even breaking a sweat. I clenched my fists and let out a slow breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. They had underestimated me, and that was their first mistake. Because if they thought I was going to quietly pay rent on my own property, well, they clearly didn't know me at all. And that's when I started thinking, patience, preparation, and a little bit of cunning might just turn the tables. The land looked calm, almost serene in the late afternoon sun, but I knew better. This was just the beginning of a battle I never signed up for, but one I was about to win. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying everything I had seen on my land. The houses, the fences, the HOA signs, and the smug smiles of neighbors who acted like I'd never existed. My mind was spinning, but one thing was clear: I couldn't just storm in and demand they leave. I needed proof, legal, undeniable proof that this was my land, my property, and that they had no right to build on it or demand anything from me. The next morning, I drove into town to the county office, my mind half focused on paperwork, half focused on how ridiculous this whole situation was. The clerk raised an eyebrow as I walked in, carrying a coffee in one hand and a folder bursting with determination in the other. I need records on land ownership for Harmony Hills, I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice had the faint edge of panic hiding beneath. She looked at me like I was insane. Harmony Hills? Oh, you mean the HOA development? Yes, I said through gritted teeth, except it's technically my land. Her eyes twitched. Oh, this is going to be fun. I spent the next 2 hours sifting through maps, old surveys, deeds, and boundary lines. Each document I pulled out made me feel like a detective in a bad crime drama, except the crime was absurdly bureaucratic. And the more I dug, the more ridiculous the HOA's claims became. Their community easement rights were barely legible, full of vague language that would confuse anyone who wasn't staring at it with a microscope. But I had something solid. My deed, signed and notarized years ago, marked every inch of my property, every boundary line, every tree, every tiny corner of land they had dared to build on, and if I could just line it all up with their constructions, well, they were in serious trouble. I returned to my property the next day, folder in hand like a general returning to the battlefield. I walked each boundary, comparing the deed to what I could see. One house sat squarely on the spot where my old vegetable garden had thrived. Another blocked the view from my favorite fishing spot. I scribbled notes, snapped photos, and even made a crude map on the back of an envelope. And then there were the people, the neighbors. Most of them seemed oblivious to the fact that their new home existed on land they didn't technically own. Some were friendly, waving or chatting as I circled the properties, but a few eyed me suspiciously. They didn't know what I was planning, and that gave me a tiny, satisfying thrill. I spent a few minutes outside the HOA office as well, just observing. The leader was there, of course, clipboard in hand, barking instructions at a worker who was clearly terrified. I couldn't help a grin. The smugness, the overconfidence, it was exactly what made this fun. Humor became my coping mechanism. I imagined little thought bubbles over the HOA leader's head. Who is this wild-eyed person with papers? Or surely they can't possibly know what they're doing? The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent a year away, and they thought a few forms and fences would make me forget that this land was mine. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I packed up my notes and took a final walk around the property. My plan was forming in my head. I could almost see it laid out like a chessboard. Every house, every neighbor, every HOA rule, all pieces that I could use to my advantage. And the best part, they had no idea I was thinking strategically. They assumed I'd be angry, maybe flustered, maybe even scared. But I wasn't any of those things. I was calculating, patient, and ready. Because in the back of my mind, I knew something crucial. The HOA had built all this without thinking about the legal implications. They'd assumed ignorance, assumed fear, assumed compliance. They had assumed I'd be a pushover. They were wrong. And by the time I finished, I had a full plan sketched out in my mind. A way to turn this ridiculous, audacious takeover into a victory that not only reclaimed my property, but, well, let's just say I had ideas about rent checks and polite reminders about who really owned the land. As I looked out over my property one last time that evening, the houses gleaming in the golden sunset, I couldn't help but smirk. The battlefield was set, the pieces were moving. And the HOA, they were about to learn that you don't mess with someone who knows their rights, knows their land, and isn't afraid to fight. It was going to be fun. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. The HOA had taken over my land, built houses across my property, and had the audacity to think they could tell me how to act on my own land. It was time for a face-to-face. I drove slowly down the gravel path, letting the crunch of my tires echo in the quiet morning. My folder of evidence rested on the passenger seat, and I could feel my pulse quicken, not with fear, but with anticipation. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The HOA office came into view, a small, pristine building with windows that gleamed in the sun like a fortress of bureaucracy. I parked the truck, straightened my jacket, and walked in exuding calm because I needed the upper hand from the start. The receptionist barely looked up. The air smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, a combination I'd come to associate with doom. And there she was, the HOA leader, clipboard in hand, standing behind a pristine desk like some kind of ruler of all she surveyed. She glanced up, eyes narrowing slightly as if she recognized a threat. "Ah," she said smoothly, as if she'd been expecting me. "You must be the owner. I hope you've had time to review our guidelines." I smiled, just a little, like I knew a secret she didn't. "Yes," I said, letting the folder rest on the desk. "I've reviewed them, and I'd like to go over a few points." Her smile was too sharp. "Of course, let's be reasonable here. The HOA exists to ensure harmony. You understand, right? Harmony requires compliance." I leaned forward, my hands resting on the folder. "Harmony, you built houses on my land while I was gone and now expect me to what? Rent from myself?" Her eyes flickered just for a second, but she quickly masked it with a polite laugh. "Well, technically, the properties are part of the community, the easement and zoning regulations." I held up a hand. No, let me stop you there. I have legal documents, surveys, and historical records proving these houses were built on my property, every inch of it, and that includes the land under your precious clubhouse. For the first time, I saw her blink. That pause, however brief, was a crack in her armor. I seized it. "You see," I continued, voice calm but firm, "I'm willing to work with the HOA. I understand community, I respect neighbors, but this isn't a negotiation about whether I like the color of your fences. This is about who actually owns the land." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and if I refused to acknowledge that? I shrugged innocently, almost as if I hadn't prepared a battle plan over the past week. "Then we go to court, but I think we'd both rather avoid that. After all, who wants to spend months dealing with lawyers and paperwork when we could settle this today?" She scoffed, flipping through her clipboard like she was looking for a magic spell to make me disappear. "You don't understand the rules. The HOA has authority. We can enforce fines, legal fees." I chuckled lightly, the sound low and deliberate. "I think you misunderstand. The only thing being enforced here is the law, and according to the law, the land is mine. So yes, I believe I will be enforcing my rights very shortly." A bead of sweat formed at the corner of her temple. I didn't gloat, it was unnecessary. My calm, collected demeanor was enough. I could see her mind racing. Who had this audacity? How could someone challenge years of HOA authority in a single meeting? I leaned back, letting the silence do its work. There was power in patience. Power in letting someone squirm while knowing exactly what you were about to do next. Finally, she spoke, voice tight. You think you can just take over like this? I smiled. I already own it, and now I get to decide how things move forward, including rent, fees, and, well, let's call it compensation for unauthorized use of my property. She froze. For the first time, the confident, untouchable HOA leader looked human. She glanced toward the receptionist as if seeking support, but the truth was obvious. I wasn't leaving, I wasn't backing down, and I wasn't scared. I gathered my folder, tapped it lightly on the desk, and said, I suggest we schedule a proper meeting with our legal teams. But until then, remember this, I own the land. You build on my land and I make the rules, simple as that. I turned and walked out, the echo of my boots in the office feeling louder than any applause. Outside, I breathed deeply, letting the morning air wash over me. The confrontation was over for now, but the battle, that had only just begun. And deep down, I knew something thrilling. The HOA thought they had power, but they had no idea what was coming next. After the confrontation, I knew brute force wouldn't solve anything, though I admit the thought of knocking down a few fences still made me smirk. No, this needed finesse, strategy, and the kind of patience only months, or in my case, years of dealing with bureaucratic nonsense could cultivate. It was time to bring in the big guns, legal muscle. I called my lawyer, someone who had the patience of a saint and the cunning of a chess master. We scheduled a meeting in my office, a small corner of my living room littered with property maps, folders, and sticky notes that made the place look like a crime investigation had collided with an art project. My lawyer arrived promptly, briefcase in hand, eyes sharp, already scanning the stacks of papers I had gathered. So, they said, sitting down and flipping open a folder, the HOA thinks they own your land. Yes, I said flatly, though I couldn't hide the amusement in my voice. They built houses across my property, put up signs, and somehow expect me to pay rent to them. My lawyer raised an eyebrow, then chuckled. They did what now? I leaned back in my chair, hands steepled. Exactly. The meeting began with a review of the evidence. My deed, the county surveys, historical property maps, and even photographs showing my land before the HOA invasion. Every piece was airtight. The lawyer nodded at each one, occasionally muttering, "They're going to regret this." As we went through the documents, I couldn't help myself. I described each house that had popped up on my property as if I were narrating a heist movie. This one, I said, pointing to a photo, stands exactly where I grew tomatoes. And that one, I added, blocks the view from my fishing dock. Honestly, the audacity of these people. My lawyer smiled, and I knew we were both enjoying this a little too much. But humor was essential. It kept me calm while my blood boiled quietly in the background. We discussed strategy. Step 1, send a formal notice to the HOA outlining my ownership in their illegal construction. Step 2, demand compensation for unauthorized use of my land. Step 3, negotiate terms that would benefit me, including, yes, rent payments from those houses. Step 4, if they refused, escalate legally, but even the threat alone would make them squirm. I left that meeting with a folder full of notices, letters, and legal jargon that would make even the most confident HOA member sweat. I felt empowered. Finally, after a year away, I had all the tools I needed to reclaim my land. Back at my property, I walked the boundaries again, imagining the reactions of the HOA and the neighbors. I pictured them reading the notices, realizing that their little empire was on shaky ground. Humor bubbled up as I thought about the HOA leader fumbling to explain herself, realizing that all the rules she clung to were meaningless against actual law. That night, I sat by the lake, letting the sun sink behind the horizon. The water mirrored my thoughts, calm on the surface, but underneath, a current building toward something unstoppable. I imagined myself sending the letters tomorrow, each one a small but devastating missile aimed directly at the HOA's inflated sense of authority. And then the best part hit me. They had built these houses assuming ignorance, assuming I'd either be away forever or too intimidated to fight. They thought they were untouchable. But here I was, folder in hand, ready to turn the tables, rent checks ready to start flowing in my favor, and a legal strategy that would leave them scrambling for credibility. I chuckled quietly to myself. Let them try to ignore me now. Let them try to argue that they had rights over my land. Every house they had built without permission was a potential rent payment. Every fence, every sign, every bit of construction was now a liability on their part. And me, I was finally in control. The night grew darker and the world seemed quiet again. My land, though filled with strangers' houses, still belonged to me. And soon, very soon, the HOA would realize what I had known all along. You don't mess with someone who knows their rights, has patience, and isn't afraid to fight back. I leaned back in my chair, folder on my lap, and allowed a small, victorious smile. This wasn't just reclaiming land. This was justice served with a side of irony, and the best part, I hadn't even started collecting yet. Tomorrow, the real fun would begin. The next morning, I drove back to my property, folder of notices in hand, feeling a thrill I hadn't felt in years. The sun was barely up and the air smelled like dew and fresh mischief. Today, the HOA was about to get their first real taste of reality. I parked near the entrance and watched from a distance as the HOA leader arrived, clipboard in hand, her stride confident and her expression smug, as if the world belonged to her. She had no idea what was coming, and I wasn't in any rush to tell her. Suspense, after all, was a powerful tool. I started with a simple move. I walked up to one of the newly built houses that had popped up on my vegetable garden last year and knocked on the door. The resident, a middle-aged man with a permagrin, opened the door, coffee in hand. "Good morning," I said brightly. "Lovely house you've got here. Did you know you're standing on land you don't actually own?" He blinked. What do you mean?" I held up the notice. "I'm the legal owner. These houses were built without permission, and technically you're my tenants now." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. I didn't wait for a response. I moved to the next house and repeated the process. Each resident looked more confused than the last. Some tried to argue, some laughed nervously, but I could see the panic growing in their eyes. This was working better than I'd imagined. By the time I approached the HOA office, the leader was outside, scanning the property, and her eyes landed on me. For the first time, she looked unsettled. My little parade of confused residents had her packing nervously. "Excuse me," she called, striding toward me. "What are you doing?" I smiled innocently. "Just ensuring everyone knows the rules. I'm happy to enforce them myself." Her face twitched. "You can't. This is the HOA's property." I cut her off, calm but firm. "Actually, no, this is my land, every inch of it, and these houses, technically they're rental properties now. You're welcome to calculate the first month's rent if you like." She froze. I could almost hear the mental gears grinding as she tried to reconcile years of authority with the stark reality in front of her. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. I was patient. That silence was mine to savor. I continued my walk, letting my presence settle over the property. The residents, still confused, whispered among themselves. Some nervously asked about paperwork, others just stared at me like I was the most terrifying person they'd ever met. Humor bubbled up in me. This wasn't just a legal move, it was a theatrical performance, and I was the star. The HOA leader finally found her voice. You can't just do this, we enforce rules here." I turned, smiling as I tapped the folder. "Rules, sure, but rules don't override ownership. Every law, every deed, every survey, they're on my side. You built without permission, that's it, that's the game, and now the game's changed." Her eyes darted toward the office as if hopping for a magical intervention. I ignored it. The power shift was already happening. The neighbors, once so confident, now looked to me for answers, and I gave them one: enjoy your new landlord. By mid-afternoon, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Calls were made, panic rippled through the HOA office, and I could see the leader frantically flipping through her binder. She looked like a cat trapped in a rainstorm, panicked, wet with anxiety, and utterly powerless. I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about balance, justice, and admittedly a little poetic irony. They thought they could move in, build houses, and dictate terms without consequence. They didn't know me. They didn't know my patience, my preparation, or my ability to turn their overconfidence into their own undoing. As the sun dipped lower and shadows stretched across my property, I walked back to the lake, letting the stillness settle over me. The HOA had been shown the first signs of their mistake. They had underestimated the person whose land they had trespassed on, and now the scales were tipping. Tomorrow would bring negotiations, perhaps more resistance, but I didn't worry. I had the upper hand, the law on my side, and a plan that would make every overconfident HOA member wish they'd never built a single house. For now, I just stood there, lake breeze in my hair, and thought, sometimes the sweetest victories come not from rage, but from patience, preparation, and a little showmanship. And this was going to be legendary. By the next morning, the word had spread. I could feel it in the air as I drove up to my property, tension, confusion, and the unmistakable scent of panic wafting from the HOA office. The residents who had once strutted confidently through my land were now wary, whispering to each other as I walked past. A few even offered awkward waves. I waved back with all the charm of someone holding all the cards. The HOA leader emerged, clipboard in hand, her perfectly ironed blouse now slightly wrinkled, her hair a little disheveled. I could see the strain in her posture, the way her shoulders tensed with every step I took toward her. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the first real acknowledgement that the power had shifted. You can't possibly enforce this," she said, her voice tight, laced with desperation. "Oh, I can," I replied calmly, holding up the folder of documents like a trophy. "And I am. Every inch of this property is mine, and those houses, technically, they're rental properties now. So yes, technically, you're all paying rent to me." Her eyes widened. I could see her scrambling for words, glancing toward the residents as if she could will them into compliance. Humor bubbled up inside me. This wasn't just legal maneuvering, it was theater, and they were playing the roles I had written for them. Some of the residents muttered, unsure if this was a joke or reality. A young couple peeked nervously from the porch of the house built on what used to be my garden. I walked over, smiling warmly. "Don't worry," I said almost conspiratorially. "This isn't personal, it's just business. The HOA decided to build on my land without permission, and now, well, rent checks are due." Their confusion made me grin. A few of them started whispering among themselves, realizing that yes, indeed, the land they had been living on without questioning anything actually belonged to someone else, and that someone else was standing right in front of them. The HOA leader tried a last-ditch effort to regain control. "You can't, these homes, this community." I held up a hand. "Stop, I suggest we get our legal teams together and make this official. Until then, let's all agree on one simple fact: the land belongs to me, everything else negotiable." She froze, realizing she had lost control. For the first time, the confident, untouchable leader looked human, confused, frustrated, and defeated. It was beautiful in a way I couldn't explain. I moved through the property, checking the boundaries, tapping on each house as if marking a victory. The residents, still hesitant, started asking questions. How much rent? When do we pay? What happens if we refuse? Each question gave me a small, quiet thrill. I answered each one calmly, clearly, and with just the right amount of humor to let them know I was serious but not cruel. By mid-afternoon, the HOA leader had retreated to her office, frantically flipping through binders, making phone calls, and muttering under her breath. I could hear the tension spilling out like a storm about to break, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was the final act of their little charade. I took a moment to walk down to the lake. The sun glinted off the water, and the gentle ripple made everything seem calm, peaceful, almost serene. And yet, beneath the surface, a current of chaos and drama had swept through my property. I thought back to the year I had been away. The quiet mornings, the solitude, the sense of ownership and peace, all of that had been disrupted. And now, through patience, planning, and a little bit of showmanship, I had restored order. Not only that, but I had turned the tables in a way that ensured respect, acknowledgement, and yes, rent payments for my troubles. As I stood there watching the houses that had once felt like intrusions now firmly under my control, I realized something important. Sometimes victory isn't just about force or anger. Sometimes it's about patience, preparation, and knowing exactly when to strike. And the HOA, they would never forget it. I let out a slow, satisfied breath. My land, my rules, my victory. The HOA leader, the residents, the community, they were all part of a new reality now. A reality where I had the upper hand, where respect wasn't demanded, it was earned and enforced. I couldn't help but chuckle as I walked back toward the house. They had underestimated me. They had thought a year away would mean I'd be passive, weak, or too tired to fight. They couldn't have been more wrong. Because in the end, my land wasn't just territory. It was proof that patience, cunning, and a little bit of audacity could turn even the most absurd situation into a victory worth savoring. And savor it I did. The days after the showdown felt surreal. Walking through my property, I could almost hear the echoes of the chaos that had unfolded just a week ago. The HOA leader, once untouchable, now tiptoed through her own office, muttering to herself like a defeated general. The residents, awkwardly polite, now kept their distance but occasionally offered hesitant smiles. They had learned the hard way who really ruled this land. I spent the morning inspecting the boundaries, checking each house that had once felt like an intrusion. Every step was a reminder: patience, preparation, and persistence could achieve what brute force never could. The fences, the community signs, even the small clubhouse, they were all still there, but they were under my terms now. I could enforce rules, collect rent, or simply remind everyone that this land belonged to me. And for some reason, just knowing that gave me a quiet satisfaction that was hard to describe. Humor became my companion again. I imagined the HOA leader at her desk, counting rent checks she didn't expect to write, frantically trying to find loopholes that didn't exist. I chuckled as I walked past one of the houses built on my old garden plot, picturing the previous smug grin on the resident's face as they handed me the first rent check. It was absurd, almost cinematic, the kind of story people would barely believe if they hadn't seen it themselves. By afternoon, the formalities had begun. Letters had been drafted, agreements signed, and for the first time in months, my property felt like mine again. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge ownership, pay overdue compensation, and even recognize that future construction without my permission was strictly forbidden. I watched from the lake as they tiptoed around, trying to maintain dignity while clearly counting every dollar they would now owe me. And yet, despite the victory, there was a strange sense of peace. The land, which had been chaotic, tense, and almost hostile a week ago, had returned to a calm rhythm. The sun reflected off the water, birds chirped, and the gentle breeze through the trees felt like nature itself was giving me a nod of approval. The battle had been won, but my life was back in balance. I took a walk along the shore, reflecting on everything that had happened. A year away had allowed me to grow, to learn patience, and to realize that sometimes the best way to win is not through anger or confrontation, but through strategy, knowledge, and timing. The HOA had overstepped, underestimated me, and for that they had learned a very important lesson. You don't mess with someone who knows their land, their rights, and isn't afraid to fight for them. Humor remained, of course. I could still picture their faces when they first realized I was collecting rent. I could almost hear the muttered complaints, the frantic phone calls, the flustered excuses, and even now I couldn't help but smile. Life had handed me a story that was dramatic, tense, and absurdly satisfying, a story I'd retell countless times, laughing at the audacity of the HOA and the cleverness of my own plan. As evening fell, I stood on the dock, watching the lake shimmer in gold and orange hues. I felt a sense of closure, but also anticipation. The HOA might try something again, they always do, but I was ready, prepared, patient, and above all, confident in my ability to protect what was mine. The victory was more than financial or legal. It was personal. It was proof that respect, strategy, and a little audacity could overcome arrogance and ignorance. And as I turned back to walk across my land, I couldn't help but chuckle quietly to myself. The HOA had learned a hard lesson, my property had been restored, and I had emerged not just as a landowner, but as someone who could face absurdity with humor, patience, and a little bit of cunning. And that, I realized, was the best kind of victory. Because in the end, it wasn't just about the land. It was about showing that sometimes the simplest truth, ownership, rights, patience, could triumph over the most confident pretensions, and for that I would always savor the memory. My property, my rules, my victory, and the HOA, they would never forget it. Every HOA has a story on HOA headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.